In Canto 11, Dante and Virgil pause before continuing on into the lower circles. They're leaving the burning tombs that were inside the city of Dis. And Dante is very keen, I think, to remind us that hell has bad smells. With hordes below us in worse pain, it's so bad, the stink, the great abyss exhales, that we draw back to the cover of a huge tomb, chiseled, I see, with I guard Pope Anastasius, lured by Photinus from the truth. It's here that Virgil says, we ought to delay our descent till we're used to this dire smell a little, then it won't bother us. So we may have noticed that whenever Dante arrives in a new circle, he interacts with a fellow Italian. It is rare that he interacts with non-Italians while he's in hell, and it's typically someone who died within some close approximation of his own lifetime. Not until Purgatory and Paradise will he really speak with men and women of international repute who lived in a more distant past. Now, the effect that that decision has is to let legend loom in the silence of the more notorious damned, which is why I like this moment. Here as he stands before the monolith of this 5th century Pope Anastasius II, the unknown of the inner torments combine with repute, notoriety. And I think this accomplishes two things. First, it's just good storytelling. We like a little bit of the unknown, and it's good not to describe every last thing. And secondly, it maintains the integrity of the poem, that he doesn't put words in the mouth of every single famous person of the past. That would have been a mistake. So another thing that Dante does is to hint to us that there's some kind of potential for tolerability in hell. Remember that Francesca and Paolo were floating in the wind-blown lust circle with more lightness than the others. Farinata emerged from his burning tomb as though hell were nothing. And here Virgil says, they can become accustomed to the smell. Then it won't bother us, he says. I think Dante likes giving us little glimmers of hope. You can get used to the smell in hell. And so as they're standing there immunizing themselves to this whiff, Virgil explains the regions which are to come. The entirety of the Inferno can be divided into 3 broad regions, and these are outlined in lines 81 through 83. Virgil says, the 3 dispositions heaven rejects: incontinence, behaving like beasts, and malice. We have just left a distinct region composing of the incontinent. We passed over the river Styx, and we arrived at the city of Dis, which is kind of a freestanding city that belongs nowhere really. But now we're about to move on to this second broad region, which is the violent. Okay? Now, as Virgil explains in line 29, force has 3 targets: God, oneself, and others. And when it comes to others, it doesn't just have to be another person's physical person, but it can include their possessions. Therefore, let's just outline what's coming. In this violent, broad region, in Canto 12, we're going to meet tyrants. In Canto 13, we're going to meet suicides. In Canto 14, we're going to meet violent scorners of God. In Canto 15, we're going to meet writers of blasphemy. In Canto 16, we're going to meet sodomites. And in Canto 17, usurers are going to transition us between the violence of this circle and the malicious fraud of the bottommost pits of hell. And so we continue on to Canto 12. At the beginning of Canto 12, we meet the Minotaur, introduced as the one conceived in the fake cow, which refers to the story of how Pasiphae entered into a fake cow in order to deceive a bull into banging her. And it impregnated her, and she gave birth to the Minotaur. No doubt that was a comfortable birth. And when we meet this virgin-hungry Minotaur, we see yet again this theme of self-cannibalism. He gnawed himself on seeing us like someone consumed by anger. And in this case, of course, we've got a Minotaur who ate people in life. You know, we know the story of the Minotaur. Boys and girls from Attica were chosen by Lot to be brought to a labyrinth where they wouldn't be able to escape, and the Minotaur ate them. The idea of a person being eaten, whether by themselves or by an animal or by anything, it seems to have a powerful significance for Dante, because in the lowest circle of hell, we're going to find Brutus, Judas, and Cassius being eternally chewed by Satan. All right, so how are the tyrants tormented? They are boiled in a river of blood, the river Phlegethon. The river loops around a plain and is guarded by centaurs who track down sinners with arrows. I could see a broad-bowed river, like one totally ringing a plain. Centaurs chased, armed with arrows, like they used to raid on Earth. Lines 73 to 76 of Canto 12. Thousands of them patrol the river, shooting souls out of the blood, more than their sins allow for. This is a perfect setting for violent tyrants, because it alludes through imagery, I think, to the historical vulnerability of exposed inhabitants of those European plains, where they were constantly being invaded by Huns, Magyars, Tartars, Mongols, who used to come galloping across the steppes to devastate Eastern Europe. And it was their horsemanship that gave the first rise to the legend of centaurs, the half-man, half-horse. So here the tyrants are, quite perfectly, sport for the centaurs, beyond their specific prescribed pains in hell, which are also quite excruciating. By the banks where the blood boils, and those boiling scream out. They were under to their eyebrows. So the tyrants are boiling in the river up to a depth in accordance with how bad they were. The people who are up to their eyebrows are Alexander the Great, Dionysius, who was a very renowned tyrant in Sicily, Etzalino III, who's a Ghibelline, and Obizzo de Esta, the blonde one. Esta is the family name that Ronaldo belonged to, the knight and hero of Tasso's liberation of Jerusalem. Next in this river came people with head and chest stuck out. So on it flows, lower and lower, till only feet get bloodstained. Dante loves that. He loves the gradation of the torments. But it gets deeper again in the place where tyranny weeps, the centaur tells them. There the divine justice pierces that scourge on earth Attila and Pyrrhus and Sextus. Sextus Pompeius, here he is in the tyrant circle. He was in opposition to the Second Triumvirate at a time when the Second Triumvirate was forcibly removing farmers from their property, from their land, and just giving it to soldiers. We read in Appian that a lot of these dispossessed farmers turned to Sextus Pompeius. That includes Virgil was put out by this. We know from reading Suetonius. Virgil himself. Here we go. Maecenas had to intercede. Maecenas is one of Octavian's advisors. In Suetonius' Life of Virgil, he dedicated the Georgics to Maecenas because he had rendered him aid when the poet was still but little known against the violence of one of the veterans from whom Virgil narrowly escaped death in a quarrel about his farm. So Virgil was almost put out. Only because he had the ability to write poetry was he spared. The first Georgics by Virgil entreats Caesar. He says, "Thou, propitious Caesar, guide my course, and to my bold endeavors add thy force. Pity the poets and the plowman's cares. Interest thy greatness in our mean affairs, and use thyself betimes to hear and grant our prayers." In his first Georgics, then, Virgil is entreating Caesar to cease the dispossession. So the inclusion of Sextus Pompeius in the violent circle of hell is based on his piratic behavior that is described in Lucan civil wars. Should we blame Dante then for putting Sextus Pompeius here, admittedly violent, but at war with tyranny? I think it's clear enough that Dante didn't have access to certain historians that are accessible to us today, people like Suetonius, Appian, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus. There's no way Dante had access to them. Otherwise, people like Nero and Caligula would have left an imprint on his mind. They don't get any mention here. Sextus Pompeius in the violent circle for tyrants over Caligula, over Nero, over Herod. It tells you that there's a great deal Dante has not read. And that's kind of an irony of it, that he actually preserved so many names, Italians that we would not care about were it not for Dante. And yet so many other even bigger names are omitted entirely.